Growing up, my older sister and I discovered that when playing Super Mario Bros., when one player was jumping over a pit, the other one could pause the game. When the game was unpaused, more than likely that player would fall into the pit, losing their turn. Now, me being the fair-minded individual I am, I would never stoop to that tactic. But my sister used it relentlessly. On one occasion, my reaction was less than peaceful, and let's just say that was the only time I was ever grounded from playing video games during my entire childhood. But it got me thinking about how many of my gaming memories involve the pause button. Why did this mechanic even exist in the first place? For as long as I've played video games, there's always just been the pause button, so it's easy to assume that it's always been there. But as with many mechanics, there was a time when it didn't exist. For instance, I can't think of a single arcade cabinet that ever had a pause button. And that makes sense, because when playing an arcade game, if you suddenly have to leave, it doesn't really care. It already has your quarter. In fact, there was nothing quite like being a 10-year-old kid at the arcade and somebody couldn't finish their game. They would gladly just hand the controls over to you, or whoever else was standing nearby. And if you were a kid who'd already burned through your quarters, which I often was, that was basically one of the greatest gifts a stranger could give you. The point was, an arcade cabinet didn't care if your pizza order had just came, if your parents were leaving, or whatever other reason you had to leave. The game just continued, whether you could or not. Once an arcade game started, there were really only two ways it ended. Either game over, or you just had to leave. Of course, when the experience moved from the arcade into your living room, then the entire context changed. There might be times when you had to pee, or the phone rang, or your parents were leaving to go visit the grandparents, and that meant you were leaving too. There was a lot more potential for interruption once video games moved into your home. So there was a need to address this. And one of the earliest answers to this problem showed up all the way back in 1976. The Fairchild Channel F had a button labeled Hold, which I love. It sounds so much more civilized. "Excuse me, do you mind if I put this game on hold? I believe my pizza pocket is ready." It wasn't until 6 years later that Atari gave the idea a different name. The Atari 5200 shipped with a button labeled simply Pause right next to Start and Reset. Now, as time would go on, much like I would, most of us would completely take the pause button for granted. It's completely normal now, but there was a time when it wasn't. The industry and gamers would find many inventive ways to use this mechanic. Growing up, I soon learned that pause wasn't just convenient for when the Disney afternoon came on. Sometimes it was just nice to have when your hands were getting so sweaty that you needed some time to wipe them off on your shorts. I also had a friend growing up who wasn't much of a gamer, and he would get himself so worked up during a game that he would have to pause just to keep from having a conniption. Then there were other tricks that you learned. For instance, in Blaster Master, when you were fighting a boss, if you paused the game on the right frame, your weapon would continue to do damage even when the game was paused. And that was pretty sweet. Sometimes a pause would just allow you to get your bearings, allow you to identify everything on screen, give you a bit of an advantage. As time went on, some games would start hiding on-screen elements whenever you hit the pause button. But that's not the only way developers would make use of pause. Soon pause meant you could look at a map, change equipment, and eventually some would actually let you save your game. And that mechanic, being able to save, would eventually replace another inventive way some would use the pause button. I cannot tell you how many times I paused a game just because I had to leave the house and just left the console running, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. You would do this because for many games it was the only way you could avoid losing progress. And coming back was always a little stressful. Did I ruin my console? Did somebody turn it off? I know at least on one occasion the power went out. Nintendo's official stance on this was not to do it. Well, at least not to leave the TV on, as it might cause burn-in on your screen. Of course, if you resorted to this tactic, I think most of us knew to turn the TV off anyhow, because nothing upset an 80s or 90s dad more than leaving a light on in an empty room or the TV on when no one was watching. I noticed a trend recently on YouTube with videos titled things like, "I left X game running for X amount of days or hours and this amazing thing happened," or "You're not going to believe what happened." And I don't know if it's just because games were simpler back then, but we used to leave our games on for days, and I'm here to tell you, nothing interesting ever happened. Now, if you've had an experience different from mine, feel free to let me know in the comments. But before saving and battery backups became common, pausing was the only thing we had to preserve our progress. I think one of the greatest uses of the pause button, although in practice it was usually not as good as it sounded, but I'm talking about the slow-mo feature that was built into many controllers. The one I'm most familiar with is the one that's found on the NES Advantage controller, which was released in 1987. When you turned it on, it basically worked by rapidly pausing and unpausing the game, up to 27 times a second, according to one report. Now, depending on the game, it just wouldn't work. For instance, games where the pause button would bring up a menu. But I do remember one game in particular.
A shoot 'em up from Konami. Konami. Called Stinger.
I was actually able to play through that game entirely using the slow-mo feature. And looking back, I don't think I would have beat it without that little trick. Now, here's the part where I might risk sounding like an old curmudgeon. Because if you grew up playing games in the 80s or 90s or even into the 2000s, you probably had an interaction similar to this one, where you said, "Mom, I can't come right now. I'm in the middle of a game." Only for your mom to reply, "Just pause it." Entire generations of kids have had some version of that interaction. And to be honest, that's one of the reasons I've always had a bit of a struggle with modern gaming. I like playing games on my time. If I need to get up and do something, I can get up and do it. If somebody needs me, I can put the controller down. There are times when I can play for 3 hours, but other times when I can only play for 20 minutes. That's the philosophy the pause button was designed for. But the moment a game becomes shared, when it goes online, when it becomes multiplayer, we're back to the same problem that existed in the arcade. The game doesn't wait for you anymore. And don't get me wrong, that's not a criticism of modern or online gaming. Sharing the game with other people can be genuinely enjoyable and exciting, but it comes with a trade-off. You have to play on the game's time. And I say this because the more I've thought about something as simple as the pause button over the last few days, the more I realize how important it has been to my enjoyment of games. Something so simple ended up being so important. And maybe that's the part I miss most about simpler games from simpler times. Not so much because they were better, but it just felt like they were more, I would say contained. You could turn them on, you could play for a while, pause, and then walk away and come back when you were ready. It's almost as if the games back then fit into your life, rather than you having to fit your life around the game. I do find it interesting, though, how many memories I have, and probably you have too, that are tied to a button whose entire purpose was really just to make nothing happen. And none of those memories were really about stopping a game. They were about what would happen when you could or you couldn't. Clocking my sister because she kept making me fall into a pit. Getting a free game in the arcade because a complete stranger's pizza order was now up. Coming home from my grandparents and hoping I didn't fry my NES because I left it on all day. Thinking about this, it's obvious that the pause button didn't just freeze things on screen. It acknowledged that while playing video games is fun, there might just be times when you have something more important you need to do. So now I'm interested to know what you think. Do you think the pause button is one of the reasons why older games felt easier to fit into your life? Or do you think I'm just giving one little button way too much credit? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, Happy gaming, my friends.